Good morning, everybody. I have a problem. We're going to be talking a little bit about vulnerability this morning as we study through the Bible, and I just figured I'd go ahead and be vulnerable right up front. I have a problem. I'm broken. It happened this summer. I didn't know how bad it was when it happened, but basically my problem is I can't stop looking at things on the computer that make me lust, and they're waves. I pay every month, don't tell Megan, subscriptions to be able to go to websites where I can see live webcams of waves all around the world. And I want these waves. I want to surf on these waves. And like any secret obsession, eventually it became a full-blown manifestation. We found ourselves in Costa Rica for the month of July for a sabbatical. And within the first week of our trip, we were staying at a house on the beach. And the waves in Costa Rica looked a little bit different than the waves down in Pawleys Island. And I can show you a picture of the wave right behind our house. This is Cooper and Judah about to go into a wave that they were lucky to not get their head taken off by. And so we would surf every day on these waves. And one day we'd been surfing for a couple hours at this break right here. And the kids came in and I was tired. I should have come in, but I just thought, I'm going to try to just catch one more wave. That's when you should come in. And I was trying to paddle into this wave, and the thing just stood up, and I just went right over the falls and just hit head first into the sand. And I blacked out, had a concussion, dislocated some stuff, but my biggest pain was like my neck. Like I couldn't move my neck. I did this for a couple days, and the pain was getting so bad that we got in touch with a friend who lived down in Costa Rica, and his wife was a massage therapist. I was like, do you think your wife could help me out? I can't turn my head. And he said, you don't need a massage, you need a doctor. So I began meeting with this doctor who was like a holistic chiropractic guy. So he had me hung upside down, snapping stuff around in traction. And then, he was like, there's great painkillers. So between seeing him about every other day, ice all the time, and painkillers every couple hours, I just tried to keep surfing for the rest of the week, for the rest of the month. And when I got home, my left hand had kind of stopped working. It was just closed up like this, and the pain in going all the way down my left arm was just getting worse and worse. So it's like, all right, we might need more than painkillers. Might need a doctor. And so we went to get x-rays and then MRIs and then CAT scans, and so it turns out that I hadn't sprained my neck. I'd broken it. And I'd broken my C7 vertebrae in two. So now I have two C7 vertebrae, which is really special. I know, right? So it's good. I have a need to be special, so, and so now here I am looking like Buzz Lightyear this morning, ready to take us into the Trinity and beyond. But thank you. Thank you. You over there. So I'm going to try not to whip my head around too much today, but here's why I want to start with that story. For one, just to not have to tell it 1,000 times, and then for two, it's dangerous to be broken but not know how broken you are. I knew that I was hurt. I just didn't know how bad it was until I saw it on the screen. And that's when it actually sank in. Whoa, this is way worse than I thought. And this is going to change things for way longer than I hoped. I knew I was hurt. I didn't know how bad. And now I get to wear this ridiculous brace, and it keeps my head from turning. It keeps me from doing further damage. And the doctors say, look, you have to do this. If you don't, you have a disability for the rest of your life. And thank God my nerves have gotten better. I can use my left hand again. I've started to be able to play the guitar again, which is good. But this is uncomfortable. And I don't like being vulnerable. I like being strong. I like being able. I don't like being disabled. I don't like being slowed down. I don't like being weak. And I don't like that everyone can see there's something really wrong with that guy. And in the story that we're going to read today, as we keep going through Hebrews 11, we're going to see there's something really wrong with these guys. But what I love about the Bible and what tells me it's so valid and legitimate and authentic is the Bible's not shy about telling us how broken these people are. If we were making this up, we wouldn't include everything that the Bible does, would we? But we're going to be looking in Hebrews 11, verses 17 to 21. And so if you need a Bible, you can raise your hand and we'll get you one. If you don't need a Bible, but you've got a Bible, you can turn it on or turn in it to Hebrews chapter 11. And we'll read through our next heroes of faith here, starting in verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. And by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Okay, so we're covering 4 generations here in Hebrews 11, and this is a really unique part of Hebrews 11 because, as we've gone through this series on By Faith, we've talked about some of the heroes. We talked about Noah, and we've talked about Enoch, and also started to talk about Abram in the last couple weeks. But right here, it switches from, this one guy, and then a couple hundred years pass, and then this other guy who's kind of unrelated to that guy. And it's going to stop just bouncing from hero to hero, and it's going to tell you about a family. 4 generations. So it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we got like a great-grandfather, a grandfather, a father, and a son. All right here in this one section of Hebrews 11. So we're talking about a family affair. And what's so beautiful in this family is we're going to see that there's worship from start to finish. I love the very first thing that it mentions about Abraham right here is his willingness to offer Isaac. We'll talk about that. But all the way at the end of it, it talks about Jacob leaned on his staff as he was dying and worshiped. That's a beautiful picture of worship that actually goes all the way through our life, from intensity all the way through longevity. Like worship shouldn't just be something that we do when we're young and then we just kind of slide into, numbness, or we just kind of stop caring. I love this picture. It's one of my favorite verses on worship in the whole Bible, actually, that Jacob, as he was dying, leaned on his staff and worshiped. I want that to be true for me too. But I love that you see in these 4 generations, worship and faith are passing down from generation to generation. It's a beautiful thing. And so as we've been talking about faith, we've recognized faith is not just a belief, it's a lifestyle. Faith is, as we've talked about, it's hearing the voice of God and trusting the heart of God enough to act on what you've heard. That's what you're going to see in these characters. They hear the voice of God. They trust the heart of God enough to act on what they've heard. And to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in particular, if you're a note taker or a student of the Bible and you want to see some of this up close, you could write down Genesis 12, 26, and 35. Because in each of those chapters, God appears in a very similar way from generation to generation. So he comes to Abraham, Genesis 12, says, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to be with you, I'm going to make you a blessing to the whole world. And then in Genesis 26, he does the exact same thing to Isaac, very similar language. And then in Genesis 35, he visits Jacob and gives very similar language again. I'm going to bless you, I'll be with you. I'm going to make you a blessing to the whole world. Each of those generations do the exact same thing in response. They stop, they worship, they build an altar, they make an offering, they worship, and then they move forward in faith. And I love this, that we see how important worship is. God appears, the people respond in worship. That's why we take time every Sunday morning to sing these songs, to pray these prayers, to read these creeds or these verses together. It's an important thing that we respond to what God's doing in worship. I told you about Jacob at the end of his life, but this starts with Abraham offering Isaac. It's a beautiful story. It's a troubling story. It's actually a pretty Pretty uncomfortable story in Genesis 22, but it's the first place in the Bible you find the word worship. When Abraham says, the boy and I are going to go and worship, he's talking about making a sacrifice, offering that which is most precious to him. So let's zoom out just a little bit. Abraham, who are we talking about again? We're talking about what Paul calls the father of our faith in Romans, or who Isaiah calls a friend of God. 10 generations passed between Adam and Noah. 10 more generations are going to pass between Noah and Abraham. And Abraham is going to show us what it looks like to be a man of faith. And it's a little bit surprising when you start to look at his story. We've talked about that in the last few weeks. Now, what's most amazing about this to me is that God is actually going to name himself after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When God shows up to Moses, Moses says, who do I say sent me? And he says, you tell him I am who I am. And you tell him, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God wants to be named forever. He says, this will be my name forever. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God takes on the name of these 3 men. That's wild. It's not just this one-way thing. God is actually interested in a relationship. He wants to take on their name. He's going to give them new names. And the question right out of the gate to me is, why? Like, what is it in these guys' lives that would make God want to take on their name for the rest of eternity? Why will God be known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Because, yeah, you see profound faith. Yes, you see radical obedience. But you also see a stumbling faith, a faltering obedience. You see fits and starts in these guys. They're not perfect. Last week, Stalls talked about, future were your children back then. Abraham and Sarah didn't have any children, and so they're kind of nobodies from nowhere with nothing to offer. That's what they were until God crashed the party. And then finally God does. He gives them this miracle baby after they kind of mess things up and try to do it on their own. And then God says, offer your son Isaac, the son whom you love. Offer your son Isaac. Okay, now that's the first place you find the word love in the Bible, too. Genesis 22:3. Abraham is going to be willing to do this. This is an incredible thing. So Abraham doesn't know that God's not a God who would require child sacrifice. He doesn't know that yet. Abraham grew up in Ur of the Chaldees. This is in Babylon. Pagan gods. His father, Joshua 24, says his father was an idol worshiper. So Abraham grew up around these pagan religions, where it was actually pretty common for human sacrifice, especially child sacrifice, to be part of how you please those gods. And God's not going to reveal that he hates child sacrifice for a few hundred more years in the Bible. So Abraham doesn't know that God's not a God who would require this. He doesn't know that. And so God tests Abraham. He says, offer your son. Abraham's worst fears are being confirmed. God is just like those other gods. Of course God's going to ask this. See, it's an actual real test for Abraham. It's not a simple thing. Hebrews 11 tells us right there. Abraham believed, okay, God could raise Isaac from the dead, which there's no precedent for that in the Bible. That hasn't happened yet. There hasn't been a resurrection yet in the Bible. So it's like, how does Abraham go through with this? Because Abraham's not afraid to wrestle with God when it seems like God's acting out of character. You remember what Abraham did when God said, hey, Sodom and Gomorrah are so wicked, we're going to wipe them out and start over there. Abraham says, no, you're not. It's the same thing that Moses did when God said, Moses, the children of Israel are so stubborn, we'll wipe them out and start with you. Moses goes, no, you're not. Habakkuk objects to God. Jeremiah objects to God. Job objects to God. And these heroes of our faith are not afraid to wrestle with God. And God apparently is not afraid to let them. He's pleased to let them. God's actually pleased to hear what they have to say. But Abraham doesn't wrestle here. Why? Why doesn't Abraham wrestles for Sodom and Gomorrah. He fights God on that, but he doesn't fight God on this. Why? He probably thought, of course God would require this. That's what the gods are like. But through this test, He's going to show the heart that's willing to offer everything, but he's going to learn that God loves that heart, but God's not the kind of God who delights in sacrifice. He delights in mercy, and God's not a God who requires sacrifice. God is a God who provides it. He's going to learn that through this, but he's not going to know that until this. And psychologists talk about implosion or flooding therapy. Are you familiar with this? Where you basically, if someone comes in and they have this real fear of something, you flood them with it to take them to the edge of the emotional experience that they could ever imagine with that, and through that they can actually conquer the fear. Some scholars say that's what's going on here. It's Abraham's worst fears. Of course God is like that, and God takes him right to the edge of that, right to the edge. And through that intensity, he's able to shed that paradigm and forget that image of God and learn, no, God's not like those other gods at all. So he has a great faith. He has a loving heart. He learns about the character of God, and he worships in that way. Well, let's also think about the faith of Isaac, because Isaac was supposed to carry the wood up that mountain. Now, I have 4 boys, from 17 down to 9. If I tried to put a bunch of firewood on my 9-year-old and go up Stone Mountain, how well do you think that would go? I'll tell you, not well. It wouldn't go very well with my 17-year-old either. But sometimes we think, like Isaac's this little baby carrying firewood. Guys, Isaac, if he's strong enough to carry firewood, he's strong enough to overtake this old man. And Isaac lays down on the altar. Isaac lets himself be bound, just like Jesus, who let himself be arrested, let himself be nailed. There's one of my favorite lyricists is a guy named Michael Card, and he has a song called Why. Listen to it sometime on Spotify or whatever, and he says this: why did it have to be a heavy cross he was made to bear? Why did they nail his feet and hands? His love would have held him there. Jesus let himself be nailed, but all the legions of angels were at his disposal if he had wanted to avert the plan. But Jesus surrendered. Isaac surrendered to this plan. That's amazing faith. And then what it commends Isaac for in Hebrews 11 is for blessing his kids. So a blessing in that ancient culture was like a guarantee of the favor of God in your future. And Isaac speaks that blessing over the next generation. So with Abraham, we see something about worship. With Isaac, we see something about a heart for the next generation. A blessing being given to the next generation. I remember when I first started leading worship at Grace back in 2000, and then we finally moved down in about 2002, 2003, my kids were really little, and so I probably just had 2 boys at the time. They were super little. So I was kind of young. I was like 23, leading worship, like super passionate and all this stuff. And Buddy would say stuff like, we want to go after the next generation. We're going after the next generation. I'm like, yeah, I'm in. Yes. And then finally he goes, you're not the next generation. Your kids are. And I was like, oh, yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. See, with Isaac, he saw into the next generation and spoke blessing into the next generation. It's one of the big things we talked about a lot around here over the years, having a heart, not just to see God do something in our day, but to steward what God's doing in our day so that it actually goes from glory to greater glory in the next generation's day. You see that in Isaac. That's a beautiful thing. And if we're not careful, I think we'll become so kind of chronocentric, where it's all about our time, our generation, our day. We can't live that way. We can't do it. 1948, McDonald's opened its doors. Same year as Polaroid invented its first camera. All of a sudden, in 1948, you could take a picture. This is groundbreaking. Take a picture and then see it a few seconds later. You didn't have to wait anymore. All of a sudden, you could order a hamburger and have it like 30 seconds later. Not long after that was the microwave. Right behind that was squeeze bottles for ketchup. And things have only gotten faster since then, haven't they? We can tend to just sprint through everything, and sometimes you'll hear someone say, Life's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Be careful, pace yourself, be wise. Life's not a sprint, it's a marathon. I'm here to tell you and remind you, it ain't a marathon, it's a relay. And it doesn't matter how fast you run your part if you drop the baton. Most of history through the Bible, look at the people of God. Most generations are clumsy in passing the baton to the next generation. That's why the Old Testament is such a mess. But in these 4 generations right here, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the baton is actually passed. It's amazing. I think about that as 4 generations of my own family. So my grandfather is a pastor. My dad, pastor. Here I am as a pastor. I'm looking at my kids like, I don't want to screw this up. So how do we make sure that we don't drop the baton? Because nobody wants to, but so many people do. Do we have a heart of worship? Do we have eyes on the next generation? And then lastly, do we have a willingness to get dirty and wrestle with God? Because the next characters it's going to talk about, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. Remember Jacob and Esau, twins. Esau is the firstborn. Jacob, this baby born, holding on to the foot of his brother. And because Esau is the firstborn, he's going to get the birthright. The birthright, that was the inheritance. If you had 2 sons, you divide up all your wealth into 3, and the birthright is going to the oldest son. He gets 2, and then the youngest gets the 3rd. So the oldest one is supposed to get extra so they can take care of all the affairs of the family and of the estate. Well, Jacob was favored by Rachel. Esau was favored by Isaac. And so Jacob and Rachel figure out a way for him to not only steal the birthright from Esau, but to steal the blessing too. The blessing of a father. Jacob wants the blessing so bad. It's a really beautiful thing in there. You can see, you can't just bless yourself. Don't you hunger for a blessing from outside? There's some beautiful stuff in there about blessing. We don't have time for it now. But Jacob is so willing to do whatever it takes to get the blessing from his father. He actually learns, if you can't get what you want by being who you are, maybe you can get what you want by pretending to be who you're not. But we never do that. Thankfully. No. Genesis 27, you can read about it. Isaac's an old man at this point. His vision's gone. His hearing is thrashed. And he's got nothing really. It's this real sensory picture in Genesis 27. And so Rachel and Jacob devised this plan that, hey, if you put this on your skin, you'll feel hairy. And if you put this on your body, you'll smell like Esau, like you've been outside. And make this stew just like Esau makes it. We can convince your dad to think that you are your brother. And so they go through with this plan, and Isaac says, who are you? And Jacob says, I am Esau. He's a con man. He's a liar. He's crooked. He burns down the relationship with his dad. He burns down the relationship with his brother. And Esau finds out about it and says, I'm going to kill him. Jacob runs. This is what he's been doing his whole life. He runs. And for 20 years, he'll be estranged from his family. But he got the blessing. And he got the birthright. He's going to realize that if you live by conning, you're going to get hosed by conning. And so he's going to meet this guy Laban, who's more tricky and more clever than even Jacob is. And Jacob's going to get worked over a couple times over those 20 years until finally he's had several kids, he's got a few wives, and he's going to be coming back to meet Esau. Jacob is scared to death. He sends messengers ahead of them. Messengers with all kinds of gifts for Esau. Bribes. Maybe enough to pay back what he stole. 600 animals, it says. And the servants come back and go, Esau's coming to meet you, and he's bringing 400 men. This is not a welcome party, guys. This is an army. And so Jacob splits up the whole company, his whole family, into 2 different groups. He says, we'll go in 2 waves. If Esau wipes out the first wave, maybe the second wave can escape. So he's still controlling, manipulating, trying to make things happen. That night, he gets everybody across the river, and he goes back, and he spends that night by himself. And he lays down to sleep, and it says he put his head on a rock. And sometime in the middle of the night, God starts wrestling with Jacob. An angel of the Lord, maybe it's a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. I'm not really sure what to do with this. The Bible's weird, guys. But sometime in the night, someone jumps Jacob. And he doesn't know who it is. He probably thinks that it's Esau. It sounds like what a brother would do. Just start wrestling. But it says they wrestled until daybreak. So I don't know if you've ever tried to wrestle. It's exhausting. So I doubt that it started at midnight and went till 6. Maybe sometime it's like 4:30 or 5. I don't know. We don't know. But somebody pounced on Jacob, and they start wrestling. It's dark. Jacob doesn't know who it is. And Jacob's going, who are you? Who are you? And they're wrestling. Until finally, this angel of the Lord, or God, touches Jacob just in the hip and dislocates his hip. So the power was there all the time. This act of wrestling was not because God couldn't overpower Jacob. Okay, all he has to do is one touch, and Jacob is immobilized. And now Hosea talks about this and says Jacob was weeping, screaming, saying, "Who are you? And I won't let you go until you bless me." This is a defining moment for Jacob. He's gone from the conniver, the crook, the schemer, the strong one, to now he's just hanging on for dear life. Now he's dependent. Now he's weak. Now his determination isn't coming out of his strength. It's coming out of his desperation. He's saying, bless me, bless me. And the angel of the Lord, God, says, another sore subject for Jacob, says, what's your name? 20 years. He blew it. What's your name? I am Esau. 20 years later, what's your name? Not because God didn't know. Because it's time for Jacob to come clean. I've been running, I've been hiding, I've been conniving, I've been conning, but I'm Jacob. I'm a crook, I'm a poser, I'm a usurper. No more games now. No more trying to be somebody that I'm not. He finally admits who he is. He's pinned down to the ground, but he's holding on for dear life. And his name gets changed. And this figure who's been wrestling him says, no longer will you be called Jacob, you'll be called Israel. Not a con man, one who has wrestled with God. It's amazing because that's going to become the name. Israel, that's the name for the people of God, for the rest of the Bible. Those who wrestle with God. Are we willing to get up close and wrestle with God? Jacob was. Jacob couldn't win that match, but even if you can't win a wrestling match, you get stronger by engaging in it. You with me? Wrestling, I mean, you have to do it with someone up close. Maybe it's like marriage. I mean, I wouldn't know about wrestling, in marriage, but maybe some of you have marriages where it feels like a wrestling match sometimes. Jacob walks away from this encounter with a new walk, a new name, and a new blessing. And he's limping away from this river, which tells me it's not always going to be clean and tidy. We're not always going to have all the answers. When we act like we do, we come across as kind of fake and disingenuous anyway. But Jacob's going to have a limp for the rest of his life. He was so strong. He was so smart. And now he's so weak. And now he's limping around. Even in Hebrews, it talks about at the end of his life, he's leaning on his staff in worship. He's still got the handicap. He's still got that crutch at the end of his life. He's still worshiping and he's still limping. There's something powerful in that to me, that limping, because, Jacob at the end of his life, as he's leaning on that staff, he's not strong, he's weak. He's not standing, he's leaning. He's not Jacob, he's Israel. Jacob wanted a blessing. Instead, he got a limp. So my question for us this morning is what if the limp is the blessing? In Genesis 33, it talks about the next day. So after the wrestling match, Jacob's going to meet Esau. Here it comes. This is the final scene. This is big. And it says, Esau ran to meet Jacob. And he embraced him. And they wept. What if all of the bribes and all of the wealth and all of the manipulation did nothing to soften Esau's heart to Jacob? But Esau was running to meet Jacob, and Jacob was limping to meet Esau. What if the limp was the big thing that softened Esau's heart? What if it wasn't his strength, but it was his weakness? Esau doesn't even want the gifts. He goes, I've got plenty of favor. Keep your gifts. I don't want that. It wasn't the gifts. What if it was the limp? And so you come back to the people of God are supposed to receive the blessing of God and then be the blessing of God to the whole world. But how are we supposed to be a blessing of God to the world if the people of God are limping around all the time? And so then you just have to go, what if that's the blessing? Showing the world we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be strong all the time. We don't have to have it all together or look like we do. Aren't we tired of kind of the church acting like that anyway? It's never really turned out too well. We can come as we are. We can come weak and vulnerable, exposed. Vulnerability, man. I hate wearing this thing. I've had to go to 2 weddings since this. You know how stupid it feels to wear a suit with a Buzz Lightyear neck brace? I don't like it. It's exposing, It feels like I see people do a double take, Like, what's wrong with that guy? I don't like that. We don't like that. Vulnerability is not comfortable. Vulnerability is beautiful. And only humans, think about this, only humans can really be naked. Like most creatures have scales or fur that grows. Only humans are just naturally naked. Even my dogs get embarrassed after a haircut. Have you ever noticed that? Like, you get your dog's groomed, they're like, oh, don't look at me, I'm hideous. It's amazing. Like, we're the only ones that can be like that. Why do we have tear ducts right in our eyes? Like, why couldn't we have had tear ducts, like, on the back of our neck, maybe? Or maybe in between our toes? Like, I was devastated. I have to change my socks. No. Why? Why are our tears right out front? Because that's where God wants them. We're not vulnerable by accident. We're vulnerable by design. Right where we don't want them, right where everyone can see them. And the irony is we love seeing vulnerability in other people. We just don't want to actually be vulnerable ourselves. We'd rather practice depravity management. But guys, we need the humility to admit sometimes we don't know. We don't know. We don't have it all together. We're a mess too. One thing that we've seen over the years of doing ministry and praying with people is that you can hide or you can heal. You probably can't do both. Amen. You might just have to risk vulnerability if you actually want to chance healing. You can hide or you can heal. You probably can't do both. We're supposed to wrestle vulnerably with Jesus, wrestle with the text. These texts are conflicting. If you read these, I'm trying to fly through a couple hundred years here, But if you read through the stories, they're disturbing. We're supposed to wrestle with it. Some of the Bible is comforting and it's precious. Some of it's downright unnerving. We're supposed to wrestle with it. The wrestling makes us stronger. Will we wrestle with God? Like Isaac, will we have an eye in the next generation like Abraham? Will we follow God even when we don't understand God? Will we trust him even if we don't get him? In each of these men's lives, we see, God is interested in where you're going. He's more interested in who you're going to be when you get there. He actually wants to see us change. So that's a big deal because for me growing up, being a Christian actually had very little to do with formation or change or discipleship. It was all about going to the right place and not going to the wrong place. And so you could actually be the worst person ever, and as long as you say you thought this, and this about something that happened a few thousand years ago, then God noted that in the computer, and your character doesn't matter at all. Guys, God's primary goal for us isn't innocence, it's character. Innocence means you haven't done anything wrong. Character means you're habitually devoted to doing the kind of thing that is right. Babies are innocent. Saints have character. The saints in these stories, these heroes, they're not innocent, but they kept walking even if it meant limping. We're ashamed of our weakness, but God's attracted to it. Guys, if you're not hearing beloved spoken over your biggest screw-ups, you're not hearing Jesus yet. Because he is faithful through all these generations, through all these stories and more, through the Old Testament. God's the one who's faithful. God's constantly putting up with this imperfect mixture of faith and doubt and faithfulness and unfaithfulness, obedience and disobedience. God's protecting Sarah when Abraham sells her up the river. God's the one who's faithful, even when we're not. And we learn these saints are actually a lot like us. They failed too. They're not perfect and fearless and spotless. They're disobedient, they're stumbling, and they're falling. And there's a verse in Proverbs 24 that I just never heard as a kid. But it gives me a lot of hope. And here's what it says. It says, the righteous will stumble 7 times and rise again. The righteous will stumble 7 times? That's completion. The righteous will stumble over and over and over and over, but they'll rise again. See, I always thought living righteously meant living perfectly. And so, growing up, guess what kind of people that creates? If you have to be perfect all the time. A bunch of people with inadequacy complex, insecurity, fear, self-hatred, self-loathing, self-contempt. That is not where you want to go, guys. The righteous will stumble 7 times and rise again. Then living righteously isn't about nailing it perfectly, but wrestling faithfully. And we keep walking. And yeah, we screwed it up. Dang, God, I repent. I confess. And I'm committed to giving it another go. That is what we see in these heroes, not this flawless streak of perfection. Bob Goff has a great line where he says, we can take comfort in the fact that we're all going to hit a few wrong notes from time to time. The real test of our faith is how we treat others when they do. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, these guys, they fail. They blow it. Isaac's fatherhood results in Jacob and Esau being estranged for 20 years. Jacob's fatherhood results in a bunch of his sons ganging up on his youngest, Joseph, and them wanting to kill him and sell him into slavery. These men are a mess. Their marriages are disasters. These people need therapy. And the Bible's trying to tell us something deeply theological. We're all broken. We're all banged up. All we like sheep, gone astray. We all have habits we can't control, past deeds we can't undo, flaws we can't correct, and this is the cast of characters in God's family. You read through this, you're like, what kind of families are these? They're just like yours and just like mine. That's what kind. The church is supposed to be a time machine from the future, though, where we can come as we are and actually be loved and be together and be supported. I love this line from James Baldwin. He says, love takes off masks. We fear we cannot live without, but know we cannot live within. I'm afraid I can't live without this mask, but I know I can't flourish inside it. And love is the place where you can let that down and be a people who limp through life, leaning on God, learning to trust, living in love. And so finally, why? Why is this good for us? Why is this a blessing? Because I would much rather be strong than weak. I would rather be able than disabled. But why? Why does God want it this way? Well, remember 2 Corinthians? His strength is made perfect when we are weak. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. And there's a very sobering tale in 2 Chronicles 26 of a guy named Uzziah. Powerful leader, great king, godly dude. And in verse 16 it says, but when Uzziah was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. I want to stay weak in a way. We need to stay dependent. We need to keep leaning not on our own understanding, but actually leaning on the Lord. Because remember, Jesus, Adam and Eve hid behind a tree, naked, vulnerable, exposed, ashamed. Jesus hung on a tree, naked, vulnerable, exposed, to conquer shame. When Jesus was resurrected, he didn't show his muscles. He showed his scars. He was wounded, but he didn't keep transferring woundedness. He transformed into where now his wounds actually bring us healing. See, he bled, but he wasn't still bleeding. There was healing that had happened, and it could become now agents of healing for others, for us. Jesus, after he resurrects, he never brings up all the ways his disciples failed him. He just restores them. That tells me no matter how bad you have blown it, your biggest mistakes don't disqualify you from being used in the kingdom of God. They actually might empower you in the most profound ways in the future. So we've got to recognize, if God will take on the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and if God will humble himself to wrestle with us, then we can just come as we are, not as we ought to be, to get real and to get healed. What if the best gift we could give the next generation isn't some impossible ideal that we ourselves don't even live? What if the best thing we could do for the next generation isn't showing them all of our highlights, but showing them our real lives and showing them that we still lean, we still limp, we still blow it. I have to apologize to my kids a lot. My oldest one, I tell a lot, you've never been a teenager before. I've never had a teenager before. Let's cut each other some slack. We're figuring this thing out, and I don't want my kids to think, oh, he's perfect, I can never be that, this isn't going to work. That's how you drop the baton. But if we'll show them, I don't understand everything, but I have heard the voice of God. I trust the heart of God enough to act on what I've heard. Even if I stumble 7 times, I'm going to get up again. I'm not going to pretend I didn't stumble. I'm not going to pretend like you never are going to stumble. But I'm not going to stop either. This seems to give hope for the next generation, because I want my kids to see I'm broken too, just like you. I need Jesus too, just like you. We're all banged up. We might not know how bad. It might not be quite as visible in your life as it is in someone else's. But until we name what's going on, it's very unlikely that we're going to experience Jesus change what's going on. We got to face it. We got to be honest. Got to let the mask down. We might still walk with a limp afterwards, but that limp could become a blessing to the world. Let's pray. God, you blow our minds. You became flesh. We read it earlier. You wear scars in eternity, Jesus. You are wounded for us. We wounded you, and you forgave us. There's no one like you. And so we can come this morning, and we do. We bring our brokenness, we bring our neediness, we bring our weakness, and we recognize you could fill us with strength. You could actually heal. You could actually use the places that we have always thought rendered us unusable. And so I pray for this time that we would come to the altar, that we would come to be whole, come to be healed, and that you would make us a church of limping, leaning lovers of you, who keep listening and keep trusting enough to keep moving forward. Pray in your name.